He stole my grandmother's ring and bled my daughter dry. So I struck back. In our legal showdown, 47 victims and one brutal ultimatum made his mask crack. The antique ring sat in my jewelry box for 43 years, waiting for the right moment. My grandmother's engagement ring, passed down through 3 generations of women who understood its true value, wasn't measured in dollars. When I finally decided to give it to my daughter Sarah, I thought I was creating a beautiful family tradition. I had no idea I was handing over a weapon that would be used to break my heart. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The morning Sarah got engaged, she called me crying with joy. David had proposed at sunrise on the beach where they'd had their first date, and she couldn't stop gushing about how perfect everything felt. That's when I knew it was time. The ring had been waiting in my jewelry box since my mother passed, wrapped in the same silk cloth she'd used to protect it. 3 generations of love stories, all leading to this moment. I can still remember unwrapping it that afternoon, the way the light caught the intricate Victorian setting, the tiny diamonds surrounding the central sapphire like stars around the moon. Sarah's eyes filled with tears when I told her the story. How my great-grandmother had worn it through the Great Depression, how my grandmother had polished it every Sunday after church, how my mother had passed it to me with trembling hands just months before she died. This ring has seen more love than most people experience in a lifetime, I told Sarah as I slipped it onto her finger. It fits you perfectly, just like it was meant to be yours. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering thank you over and over against my shoulder. In that moment, I felt like I'd done something truly meaningful, connecting my daughter to the long line of strong women who'd come before her. The wedding was everything Sarah had dreamed of. She wore my mother's dress, carried my grandmother's pearl-handled bouquet, and when the light hit that antique ring as she exchanged vows with David, I swear I could feel 3 generations of love blessing their union. David seemed genuinely moved by the family traditions we were sharing with him. He even asked me about the ring's history during the reception, listening intently as I explained each detail of its craftsmanship. For the first year of their marriage, everything seemed perfect. Sarah would show off the ring to friends, telling them the story I'd shared with her. She'd call me on their monthly anniversary dates, gushing about how David had surprised her with flowers or planned a romantic dinner. The ring was part of their love story now, and I couldn't have been happier about my decision. But somewhere around their 2nd anniversary, things began to change. Sarah's calls became less frequent, and when she did call, there was a tension in her voice I couldn't quite identify. She'd mentioned financial stress, David's struggles with his business, late nights spent arguing about money. I offered to help, of course, but she always insisted they could handle things on their own. The first real warning sign came during a family dinner last spring. I noticed Sarah wasn't wearing the ring, which struck me as odd since she'd never taken it off before, not even to do dishes or garden. When I asked about it, she gave me some vague excuse about having it cleaned, but something in her eyes told me there was more to the story. Over the next few months, I started noticing other changes. Sarah seemed anxious whenever money came up in conversation. David became increasingly distant at family gatherings, checking his phone constantly and making excuses to leave early. The easy warmth he'd shown during their engagement had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. When I tried to talk to Sarah about my concerns, she'd brush them off with forced cheerfulness that fooled no one. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was having lunch with my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, when she mentioned seeing someone who looked exactly like David at Murphy's pawn shop. Downtown, she'd thought it was strange because he seemed upset about something, arguing with the clerk behind the counter. My blood went cold as pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve began falling into place. I drove to Sarah's house that evening, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Something was wrong, and I needed to know what. When she answered the door, her eyes were red from crying, and she couldn't quite meet my gaze. David wasn't home, she said. He was working late again. But there was something brittle about the way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Where's grandmother's ring? The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized there was no easy way out of this conversation. She tried to lie at first, stammering something about having it resized, but I could see the truth written all over her face. Finally, after what felt like hours of gentle prodding and increasingly desperate denials, she broke down completely. The whole story came tumbling out through tears and broken sentences that made my heart feel like it was being torn in two. David had been struggling with his consulting business for over a year. What had started as a temporary cash flow problem had spiraled into something much worse. He'd maxed out their credit cards, borrowed against their car, even taken a second mortgage on the house without telling her. When none of that was enough, he'd started looking around for other assets they could liquidate quickly. The ring had been sitting right there on her dresser, practically calling his name. Sarah had found it missing one morning and confronted him immediately, but by then it was too late. He'd already taken it to Murphy's pawn shop, hoping to get enough money to cover their most pressing debts. The worst part was how casual he'd been about it, like it was just another piece of jewelry instead of a family heirloom with 43 years of stories attached to it. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest as Sarah described her confrontation with David. He'd been defensive at first, insisting it was just temporary, that he'd buy it back as soon as his business turned around. But when she demanded he retrieve it immediately, he'd admitted the truth that made my blood boil. He'd already tried to sell it outright, and when the pawn shop owner had offered him what David considered an insultingly low price, he'd gotten angry and stormed out. The ring was still at Murphy's, Sarah told me through her tears, but they only had 30 days to reclaim it before it went up for sale. David kept promising he'd find the money, but Sarah could see the desperation in his eyes growing stronger each day. He'd started talking about taking out loans from questionable sources, making deals with people who didn't take kindly to late payments. I sat there in Sarah's living room, surrounded by the furniture I'd helped them pick out when they'd first gotten married, listening to my daughter describe how the man she'd trusted with her heart had betrayed not just her, but our entire family legacy. The ring wasn't just jewelry to us. It was a symbol of enduring love, of women who'd weathered storms and emerged stronger, of promises kept across generations. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. David had made a critical mistake in his desperation. He'd assumed that because I was just Sarah's mother, an older woman with a modest retirement income, I'd be helpless to do anything about his betrayal. He'd underestimated the lengths a mother will go to protect not just her daughter, but the memory of all the women who'd come before her. The next morning, I called Murphy's pawn shop and spoke with the owner, a gruff but honest man named Eddie, who remembered the incident clearly. David had been aggressive and unreasonable, Eddie told me, demanding far more than the ring was worth on the secondary market and getting hostile when Eddie had explained how pawn shop valuations worked. The ring was beautiful, Eddie admitted, clearly an antique with real craftsmanship, but pawn shops had to price items for quick resale, not sentimental value. I asked Eddie what it would take to reclaim the ring, and his answer made my heart sink. $1,500 plus interest and fees, money that David clearly didn't have, and money that Sarah couldn't access without involving David in the transaction. But as I hung up the phone, a plan began forming in my mind. A plan that would not only save my grandmother's ring, but teach David a lesson about respect, family, and the consequences of betraying the people who'd welcomed him with open arms. David thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman who'd quietly accept his disrespect and move on. He was about to learn just how wrong he could be. I spent the next 3 days doing something I hadn't done in years. Research. Not the casual kind you do when you're curious about something, but the deep methodical investigation I used to conduct back when I worked in insurance fraud detection. 35 years of analyzing people's financial situations, their habits, their weaknesses, had taught me skills that most grandmothers never develop. David Mitchell, age 32, owner of Mitchell Consulting Solutions. On paper, his business looked legitimate enough, but a deeper dive into public records told a different story. 3 separate lawsuits from unpaid contractors in the past 18 months. A pattern of taking deposits for projects that were never completed. Client complaints filed with the Better Business Bureau that painted a picture of someone who was either incompetent or deliberately deceptive. His social media presence was particularly revealing. While Sarah was home crying about their financial problems, David was posting photos from expensive restaurants and golf courses, pictures of him wearing a new watch that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Check-ins at bars where the cheapest drink cost $20. Either he was living a complete fantasy, or there was money coming from somewhere Sarah didn't know about. I printed everything out and organized it in the same methodical way I used to prepare fraud cases. Bank records I could access through my connections at the credit union, where I'd served on the board for 15 years. Property records that showed the second mortgage David had taken without Sarah's knowledge. Court documents from the civil suits that revealed a pattern of financial irresponsibility going back years. By Friday afternoon, I had a complete picture of the man my daughter had married, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. David wasn't just struggling with his business, he was running what amounted to a sophisticated con game, taking money from new clients to pay old debts, always staying one step ahead of the consequences. The ring hadn't been a desperate last resort, it had been just another asset to liquidate in a long line of betrayals. That evening I drove to Murphy's pawn shop with a cashier's check for $2,000. Eddie looked surprised to see me, but his expression softened when I explained the situation. The ring belonged to my family, I told him, and I was there to bring it home where it belonged. The moment Eddie placed that small velvet box in my hands, I felt 43 years of anxiety released from my shoulders. The ring was exactly as I remembered it, the Victorian setting still perfect, the sapphire still catching light like captured starlight. But as I drove home, clutching the box against my chest, I realized recovering the ring was only the first step in a much larger plan. David had made this personal when he'd pawned a family heirloom. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, violated a trust that couldn't be rebuilt with apologies and promises. If he thought he could manipulate my daughter and disrespect my family's legacy without consequences, he was about to receive an education in exactly how wrong one person could be. Saturday morning, I called my attorney, Margaret Hoffman, who'd handled my legal affairs since my husband passed. Margaret had a reputation for being thorough, discreet, and absolutely ruthless when protecting her clients' interests. After I explained the situation and shared my research, she was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret," I said, "I want to know what legal options we have here." David forged Sarah's signature on that second mortgage. He took property that didn't belong to him and attempted to sell it. There has to be something we can do. Her response was even better than I'd hoped. The mortgage fraud alone was a felony, she explained. Taking the ring could be prosecuted as theft, even though they were married. But more importantly, the pattern of financial deception I'd uncovered gave us grounds for what she called a comprehensive legal strategy that would protect Sarah's interests and hold David accountable for his actions. The plan Margaret outlined was elegant in its simplicity. We'd document everything, build an ironclad case, and then present David with a choice. He could either agree to a divorce settlement that protected Sarah from his debts and returned her to financial stability, or we'd pursue criminal charges that would likely result in jail time and complete financial ruin. But I had something else in mind, something more personal than legal proceedings, more satisfying than court victories. David had spent months lying to my daughter, stealing from our family, and treating us all like marks in his con game. It was time he learned what happened when you underestimated a woman who'd spent 3 decades investigating people exactly like him. Sunday evening, I called Sarah and asked her to come over for dinner. She arrived looking exhausted, the stress of the past few months written in the lines around her eyes and the way she held her shoulders. David was working late again, she said, though we both knew by now that his late nights probably had nothing to do with legitimate business. Over dinner, I watched my daughter push food around her plate, too anxious to eat, too proud to admit how bad things had really gotten. She kept apologizing for the ring situation, as if David's betrayal was somehow her fault. That's when I knew it was time to show her that she wasn't powerless, that she had options she'd never considered. "Sarah," I said quietly, reaching into my purse and pulling out the velvet box, "I have something that belongs to you." Her gasp when she saw the ring was worth every penny I'd spent and every hour I'd invested in research. She slipped it onto her finger with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as she realized what this meant. The ring was safe. The family legacy was intact. But more than that, someone had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself. "How did you?" she started to ask, but I held up my hand. "The how doesn't matter right now," I told her. What matters is that you understand something very important. David thinks he can manipulate and control you because he believes you're helpless. He thinks your family won't fight back because we're just ordinary people with ordinary resources. He's about to learn exactly how wrong he can be. I pulled out the folder of research I'd compiled, watching Sarah's expression change as she absorbed page after page of evidence about the man she'd married. The lawsuits, the debts, the pattern of deception that stretched back years before he'd even met her. By the time she finished reading, her tears had stopped and something harder had taken their place in her eyes. Sarah looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the desperate anxiety she'd been carrying for months, not the defeated resignation that had marked our recent conversations. This was determination, anger channeled into purpose, the look of a woman who'd finally seen the truth and was ready to act on it. "Mom," she said, her voice steady for the first time in months, "what do we do next?" That's when I smiled and pulled out the business card Margaret had given me. Because the next phase of my plan required more than just evidence and determination. It required strategy, timing, and the kind of professional expertise that would make David wish he'd never heard the name of our family. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. David had been playing a game where he thought he held all the cards, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the power of a mother protecting her child and the memory of the women who'd come before her. Margaret's office felt like a war room when Sarah and I arrived Tuesday morning. She'd spent the weekend reviewing every document I'd provided, cross-referencing public records, and building what she called our ammunition cache. The conference table was covered with organized stacks of papers, each one representing another piece of David's carefully constructed lies. Sarah sat beside me, still wearing grandmother's ring, her posture straighter than I'd seen it in months. The defeated woman from Sunday evening had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. My daughter, but stronger, angrier, ready for battle. Margaret opened a thick folder and began laying out our options like a general planning a siege. The mortgage fraud alone carried a sentence of up to 20 years, she explained. The theft charges could add another 5. But the most damaging evidence was something I hadn't expected. David's business wasn't just failing. It was a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had defrauded dozens of small business owners out of their life savings. He's been taking deposits for consulting work he never intended to complete, Margaret continued, using new client money to pay partial refunds to previous clients who complained. The state attorney general's office has been investigating him for 8 months, but they didn't have enough evidence to move forward. Until now. She slid a photograph across the table that made my blood run cold. David at an expensive steakhouse, laughing with 2 men I didn't recognize, while Sarah was at home eating ramen noodles and worrying about their electric bill. The timestamp showed it was taken just 3 days after he'd pawned my grandmother's ring. "But here's what makes this really interesting," Margaret said, her voice taking on the tone of a predator who'd found wounded prey. "David's been transferring money to offshore accounts through a shell company registered in Delaware. That's federal wire fraud, which means we're not just talking about state charges anymore. The FBI has been very interested in our little collection of evidence." Sarah's face had gone pale as she absorbed the magnitude of David's deception. This wasn't just financial irresponsibility or business struggles. This was criminal enterprise, systematic fraud that had destroyed other families while he played the role of loving husband at home. "How many people has he hurt?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret consulted her notes. 47 clients have filed complaints so far. Combined losses of over $2 million. Most of them are small business owners who trusted him with their company's futures. People like the Hendersons who run that little bakery downtown, or Maria Santos who hired him to help expand her cleaning service. I watched my daughter's face crumble as she realized the scope of David's crimes. These weren't faceless corporations or wealthy investors. These were neighbors, friends, hard-working people who'd been destroyed by the man she'd shared a bed with for 3 years. "There's more," Margaret continued, clearly saving the worst for last. "David's been living a double life for over 2 years. The apartment in Seattle, the gambling debts in Reno, the woman in Portland who thinks she's his fiancée. Sarah, honey, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your marriage has been a lie from the very beginning." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at the photographs Margaret had spread across the table, Images of David with other women, receipts from hotels and restaurants in cities he'd claimed to visit for business. The man she'd trusted, the man she'd defended to me when I'd expressed concerns, had been systematically destroying not just their marriage, but the lives of dozens of innocent people. "I want him destroyed," Sarah said finally, her voice hard as steel. "I want him to pay for every lie, every betrayal, every person he's hurt." "What do we need to do?" Margaret smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, because I've been working on something special for Mr. David Mitchell, something that's going to teach him what happens when you mess with the wrong family." The plan Margaret outlined was more comprehensive than anything I'd imagined. We weren't just going to expose David's crimes. We were going to dismantle his entire operation, recover money for his victims, and ensure he faced consequences for every single law he'd broken. Phase 1 involved coordinating with federal investigators who'd been building their own case against David. Margaret had contacts in the FBI's white-collar crime division, and our evidence was exactly what they needed to move forward with arrests and asset seizures. Phase 2 was more personal. We were going to confront David directly, giving him one chance to cooperate fully before the federal charges destroyed his life completely. Margaret called it the Come to Jesus meeting, and she'd scheduled it for Thursday afternoon at her office. But Phase 3 was my idea, and it was the part that gave me the most satisfaction. David thought he was so clever, so much smarter than the simple people he'd been defrauding. He was about to learn that intelligence without integrity was just another form of stupidity, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was someone with nothing left to lose. Wednesday evening, Sarah and I sat in my kitchen, planning exactly what we'd say when we faced David. She'd been staying with me since Monday, unable to bear the thought of sleeping in the same house where he'd spent months lying to her face. The woman across from me bore little resemblance to the broken person I'd comforted just days earlier. "Mom," Sarah said, looking down at grandmother's ring on her finger, "I need to tell you something." I knew David was lying about the business problems, not the extent of it, but I knew something was wrong months ago. I was just too scared to admit it, too embarrassed to ask for help. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. "Because I was ashamed. Because I defended him to you so many times when you tried to warn me. Because I thought I could fix things, make him into the man I'd fallen in love with." She twisted the ring on her finger, the sapphire catching the kitchen light. I was so desperate to make the marriage work that I ignored every red flag, every warning sign, every instinct that told me something was wrong. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "Sarah, sweetheart, you're not responsible for David's crimes. You're not responsible for his lies or his choices. The only thing you're responsible for is what you do now that you know the truth." She squeezed my hands tightly, and I saw tears in her eyes again. But these weren't tears of desperation or defeat. These were tears of resolution, of a woman who'd finally seen clearly and was ready to act. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of Seattle weather that matched my mood perfectly. Margaret had arranged for David to come to her office at 2 o'clock, ostensibly to discuss some legal documents related to his business. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Sarah and I arrived an hour early, along with Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. Agent Walsh was a woman about Sarah's age, with steel-gray eyes, and the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she'd seen every type of financial predator imaginable. "We've been tracking David Mitchell for 8 months, Agent Walsh explained as we reviewed the final details of our plan. "His operation is more sophisticated than most, but he made one critical error. He got greedy, and greedy people always make mistakes that bring them down." The conference room had been set up like a courtroom, with David's chair positioned so he'd be facing all of us when he walked in. Margaret had arranged the evidence in neat stacks, each one labeled with the specific crimes it documented. The mortgage fraud, the business fraud, the theft of my grandmother's ring, the federal wire fraud charges that could put him away for decades. At exactly 2 o'clock, David walked through the door with the same confident swagger he'd shown at family dinners for the past 3 years. He was wearing an expensive suit I was certain Sarah hadn't seen before, his hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and charming. The mask he'd worn throughout his marriage, hiding the predator underneath. "Hello, Margaret," he said smoothly, extending his hand. "Thank you for setting up this meeting. I'm eager to get these business matters resolved." Then he noticed Sarah and me sitting at the conference table, and his confidence flickered for just a moment. "Sarah, honey, what are you doing here?" "And Helen, this is unexpected." "Sit down, David," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd destroyed better men than him in courtrooms across the state. "We have quite a bit to discuss." David's eyes moved around the room, taking in the stacks of evidence, Agent Walsh's federal badge clearly visible on the table, the expressions on our faces that told him his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. But he was still trying to maintain control, still believing he could talk his way out of whatever trap he'd walked into. "I'm not sure what this is about," he said, settling into the chair we'd positioned for him. "But I'm happy to clear up any misunderstandings." His voice was steady, but I caught the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for the water glass Margaret had provided. Agent Walsh leaned forward, her badge catching the overhead lights. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Agent Walsh with the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. We've been investigating your business operations for the past 8 months, and we have enough evidence to charge you with multiple federal crimes." The color drained from David's face, but he was still trying to maintain his composure. "I think there's been some mistake, Agent. My business is completely legitimate. I have all the proper licenses and documentation." Margaret opened the first folder and began laying out photographs like playing cards. David at expensive restaurants while his clients lost their savings. David with other women while Sarah worried about their marriage. David at the pawn shop, trying to sell my grandmother's ring to fund his lifestyle. "Let's start with the easy one," Margaret said calmly. "Theft of property belonging to Helen's family. A family heirloom worth approximately $8,000 that you removed from your home without your wife's knowledge and attempted to sell." "That's grand theft, David. A felony that carries up to 5 years in prison." David's lawyer instincts finally kicked in, and he stopped talking. But his eyes were moving frantically between the evidence stacks, trying to calculate how much we knew and how much we could prove. "Then there's the mortgage fraud," Margaret continued, opening the second folder. "You forged your wife's signature on documents that put her home at risk, used the money to fund your illegal business operations, and lied to federal lending institutions about your income and assets. That's another felony, with a potential sentence of 20 years. Agent Walsh took over, her voice cold as winter rain. "But the charges that really interest us are the federal ones, David. Wire fraud, money laundering, operating a Ponzi scheme across state lines. We've identified over $2 million in fraudulent transactions, 47 victims, and enough evidence to put you away for the rest of your natural life." David's composure finally cracked completely. He looked at Sarah with desperate eyes, reaching for her hand across the table. "Sarah, honey, you have to believe me. This is all a misunderstanding. These people are trying to destroy our marriage, turn you against me. I love you, sweetheart. Everything I did was for us, for our future." Sarah pulled her hand away from his reach, her voice steady and clear. "David, I want you to look at me. Really look at me. Do you see a stupid woman who's going to fall for your lies one more time?" He stared at her, and I saw the exact moment he realized that the woman he'd been manipulating for 3 years was gone, replaced by someone who saw him exactly for what he was. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know about the apartment in Seattle. I know about the woman in Portland who thinks she's your fiancée. I know about the 47 families you've destroyed with your lies. I know about every single crime you've committed, and I'm here to make sure you pay for all of it." David's last desperate attempt at control came out as anger. "You ungrateful bitch," he snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. "I gave you everything. That house, that lifestyle, everything you wanted, and this is how you repay me? By conspiring with your bitter old mother to destroy me?" The insult to me was the final straw for Sarah. She stood up slowly, grandmother's ring catching the light as she pointed directly at his face. "You gave me nothing but lies, David. That house was bought with stolen money. That lifestyle was funded by destroying other people's dreams. And my mother isn't bitter. She's the strongest woman I know, and she taught me that sometimes love means having the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard." Agent Walsh stood up and moved toward David, handcuffs already in her hand. "David Mitchell, You're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a fraudulent business enterprise. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked shut around David's wrists, he looked back at Sarah one last time. The charming mask was completely gone now, replaced by the face of a man who'd finally been caught and knew his game was over. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, but there was no power behind the threat. Just the empty words of someone who'd lost everything and was trying to inflict one last wound. Sarah walked over to where he sat, cuffed and defeated. She leaned down so her face was level with his, her voice calm and clear. "David, the only thing I regret is not seeing who you really were 3 years ago. But I see you now, and I'm going to make sure everyone else sees you too." As Agent Walsh led David toward the door, Sarah turned to me with tears in her eyes. But these weren't tears of sadness or regret. These were tears of relief, of a woman who'd finally escaped a trap she didn't even know she'd been caught in. "Mom," she said, putting her arms around me, "thank you for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Thank you for saving grandmother's ring and for showing me that I'm stronger than I ever knew." I held my daughter close, feeling the weight of the past few months finally lifting from both our shoulders. The ring was safe, David would face justice for his crimes, and Sarah was free to build a new life based on truth instead of lies. But as we left Margaret's office that afternoon, I knew this was just the beginning. David's arrest would make headlines, his victims would finally get some measure of justice, and Sarah would have to rebuild her life from the ground up. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but we'd face it together, armed with the strength that came from 3 generations of women who understood that sometimes fighting for what's right requires everything you have. The antique ring that had started this whole nightmare was back where it belonged, but its real value had never been in the gold and sapphires. Its value was in the lesson it had taught us about the difference between real love and manipulation, between family loyalty and blind trust, between the strength that comes from truth and the weakness that comes from living a lie. That evening, Sarah and I sat in my living room, finally able to breathe for the first time in months. The house felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if David's arrest had lifted a toxic cloud that had been hanging over our family. Sarah was curled up in my old armchair, grandmother's ring catching the lamplight every time she moved her hands. The local news was running the story as their lead segment. "Local businessman arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme," the anchor announced, David's mugshot filling the screen behind her. Sarah reached for the remote to turn it off, but I stopped her. "No," I said quietly. "Let's watch. His victims deserve to know that justice is finally coming." The reporter interviewed Maria Santos, the cleaning service owner who'd lost her life savings to David's scheme. She was crying as she described how she'd trusted him with her business expansion plans, how he'd promised to triple her client base within 6 months. Instead, he'd taken her $50,000 investment and disappeared, leaving her unable to make payroll for her employees. "I had to let go of 12 people, Maria said through her tears. "People who depended on me, who had families to feed. I kept thinking it was my fault somehow, that I should have been smarter, more careful. But he seemed so professional, so trustworthy." Sarah's face crumpled as she watched Maria's interview. "Mom, that woman lost everything because of the man I was married to. How many other families are out there, destroyed by his lies?" The reporter's voice continued over footage of other victims. The Henderson family, who'd closed their bakery after David convinced them to invest their retirement savings in a restaurant expansion that never materialized. Tom Bradley, a contractor who'd paid David $15,000 for marketing services and never received so much as a business card in return. Each story was the same pattern. David would identify vulnerable business owners, people who were ambitious but inexperienced with financial planning. He'd wine and dine them, show them fabricated success stories, convince them that he was their ticket to prosperity. Then he'd take their money and move on to the next victim, always staying one step ahead of the consequences. The FBI estimates that Mitchell defrauded over $2 million from small business owners across 3 states, the reporter concluded. He used sophisticated psychological manipulation tactics and forged documents to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. Many victims report that they trusted him completely, considering him not just a business consultant, but a friend. I turned off the television and looked at my daughter, who was staring at her hands in her lap. The weight of David's crimes was settling over her like a heavy blanket, and I could see her struggling with emotions she didn't know how to process. "Sarah," I said gently, "you know that none of this is your fault, right? You were a victim too, just in a different way." She looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than they had that morning. "I keep thinking about all the dinners we had together, all the times he'd come home and tell me about his successful meetings with clients. He was so convincing, Mom, so passionate about helping these business owners achieve their dreams. I actually admired him for it." "That's what made him dangerous," I replied. "The best con artists don't just lie about facts, they lie about who they are at their core. They become whoever they need to be to get what they want." My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. Her voice carried the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just landed a career-defining case. "Helen, I wanted to update you on the arraignment. David's being held without bail. The judge considered him a flight risk, especially after Agent Walsh presented evidence of the offshore accounts and the fake passport they found in his apartment." "Fake passport?" Sarah's head snapped up at my words. I put the phone on speaker so Sarah could hear Margaret's explanation. "He had a complete false identity prepared, Sarah. Driver's license, social security card, even credit cards in the name of Michael Davidson. He was planning to disappear as soon as the investigation got too close." The room went silent as we absorbed this information. David hadn't just been stealing money and living a double life. He'd been preparing to abandon everything, including Sarah, the moment his schemes started unraveling. She would have woken up one morning to find him gone, with no explanation, no goodbye, nothing but empty bank accounts and a mountain of debt. "There's more," Margaret continued. "The woman in Portland, the one who thought she was engaged to David, her name is Rebecca Chen, and she's been sending him money for 8 months. $50,000 so far, all for various business emergencies that never existed. She's flying up tomorrow to testify." Sarah's face had gone pale. He was planning to marry her too? According to the evidence we found, he was planning to marry 3 different women in 3 different states, each one thinking she was his only love, each one funding his lifestyle while he prepared to disappear with their money. After Margaret hung up, Sarah and I sat in stunned silence. The scope of David's deception was beyond anything we'd imagined. This wasn't just financial fraud. It was systematic emotional terrorism designed to destroy the lives of everyone who'd made the mistake of trusting him. "I need some air," Sarah said suddenly, standing up and walking toward the back door. I followed her onto the porch, where she leaned against the railing and stared out at my small garden. "You know what the worst part is?" she said without looking at me. "It's not the money or even the lies about other women. It's that he made me doubt myself so completely that I almost didn't fight back. He had me convinced that I was the problem, that I was too demanding, too suspicious, too emotional. I moved to stand beside her, close enough to offer comfort but far enough to give her space to process. That's what abusers do, sweetheart. They make you question your own reality until you can't trust your own instincts anymore." "When did you know for sure?" she asked. "When did you realize he was lying about everything?" I thought back to all the small moments that had accumulated into certainty. "Remember last Christmas when he gave you that expensive necklace? The one from Tiffany's that cost $3,000? Sarah nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to her throat where the necklace had once rested, before she'd returned it to the store for cash. "That was the same week you called me crying because you couldn't afford groceries. A man who truly loved you would never buy himself luxury items while letting you go hungry. That's when I knew his priorities were fundamentally wrong." "But I made excuses for him," Sarah said bitterly. "I told myself he was just bad with money, that he didn't understand how tight things were. Because you loved him, and love makes us want to see the best in people, even when they don't deserve it." I reached over and took her hand, feeling the familiar weight of grandmother's ring beneath my fingers. "But love also means protecting the people who matter to you, which is why I couldn't stand by and watch him destroy you." We stood there in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the evening sounds of the neighborhood. Children playing in nearby yards, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic. Normal sounds of normal lives, the kind of peaceful existence Sarah would be able to build now that David's chaos was out of her life. "Mom," Sarah said finally, "I want to do something for the other victims. I want to help them get their money back if possible. and I want to make sure they know they're not alone in this." Her words filled me with pride. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the betrayal and humiliation, her first instinct was to help others who'd suffered similar losses. This was the daughter I'd raised, the woman of character who'd been hidden under months of manipulation and self-doubt. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "I want to testify at his trial. I want to tell the court and the jury exactly what kind of man David Mitchell really is. Not just the financial crimes, but the emotional manipulation, the way he systematically broke down my ability to trust my own judgment." The strength in her voice reminded me of my mother, who'd never backed down from a fight when principle was involved. 3 generations of women who understood that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do. "That's going to be difficult," I warned her. "His lawyers will try to discredit you, make you look like a vindictive ex-wife who can't be trusted." Sarah turned to face me fully, and I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there since before she'd met David. Determination, clarity, unshakable resolve. "Let them try. I have something they don't have." "What's that?" "The truth, and 3 generations of strong women who taught me that the truth is worth fighting for, no matter how much it costs." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Rebecca Chen, the woman from Portland who'd thought she was engaged to David, had arrived earlier than expected. She stood on my doorstep at 8 in the morning, clutching a folder of documents and looking like she hadn't slept in days. "Are you Helen Martinez?" she asked, her voice shaky but determined. "Sarah's mother? I'm Rebecca Chen. I think we need to talk." I invited her in, noting the expensive engagement ring on her left hand that looked suspiciously similar to the one David had given Sarah. Rebecca was younger than my daughter, maybe 25, with the kind of earnest face that suggested she'd lived a sheltered life before David had targeted her. Sarah emerged from the kitchen with coffee mugs, stopping short when she saw Rebecca. The 2 women stared at each other for a moment, both recognizing the other as a fellow victim of the same predator. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca said immediately. "I had no idea he was married. He told me you were divorced, that it had been finalized months ago. He showed me papers, official-looking documents that seemed legitimate." Sarah set down the coffee mugs and moved to sit across from Rebecca. "How long?" she asked quietly. 18 months. He said he was building a consulting business and needed investors to get started. I believed him completely." Rebecca's voice broke slightly. "I gave him everything. My savings, my inheritance from my grandmother, even money I borrowed against my 401k, $87,000 total." I felt sick listening to Rebecca's story. David had refined his techniques with each victim, learning from his mistakes, becoming more sophisticated in his manipulation. Sarah had been practiced for what he'd done to Rebecca and countless others. "The engagement ring," Sarah said, nodding toward Rebecca's hand. "Where did he say he got the money for that?" Rebecca looked down at the ring like she was seeing it for the first time. "He said business had been good, that one of his clients had paid a large bonus. I was so happy, so grateful that he wanted to marry me despite my modest background." She laughed bitterly. "I actually thanked him for choosing me." Sarah reached across the table and took Rebecca's hands. "Listen to me carefully. None of this was your fault. David is a professional predator who spent years learning how to identify and exploit good people. The fact that you trusted him doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human." Rebecca began to cry, not the quiet tears of embarrassment, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone finally releasing months of suppressed pain. Sarah moved to sit beside her, offering the kind of comfort that only another victim could provide. "I keep thinking about all the warning signs I missed," Rebecca said through her tears. "The way he'd disappear for days without explanation, the phone calls he'd take in another room, the business trips that never seemed to generate any actual business. The expensive restaurants when he claimed to be struggling financially," Sarah added, "the designer clothes he'd wear to meetings with potential investors, the way he'd always have a plausible explanation for every inconsistency." I listened to them compare notes, watching 2 intelligent women piece together the full scope of David's deception. Each revelation built upon the last, creating a comprehensive picture of a man who'd turned manipulation into an art form. "There's something else," Rebecca said, pulling documents from her folder. "I hired a private investigator 3 weeks ago when David started avoiding my calls. He found evidence of at least 6 other women across 4 states, all being courted for marriage, all sending him money for various business ventures." Sarah's face went white. "6 others?" Rebecca nodded grimly. Jennifer in Denver, who thought she was investing in a real estate development company. Lisa in Sacramento, who believed she was funding a tech startup. Amanda in Phoenix, who was told her money was going toward a restaurant franchise. All of them engaged to the same man, all of them thinking they were his one true love. The magnitude of David's crimes was staggering. This wasn't just fraud. It was a systematic campaign of emotional and financial terrorism that had destroyed dozens of lives across multiple states. The man Sarah had shared a bed with for 3 years was a serial predator who'd perfected the art of making women fall in love with a fantasy. "We have to stop him," Sarah said with quiet intensity. "Not just for us, but for all the other women who might become his victims if he ever gets out of prison." Rebecca wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Agent Walsh asked me to coordinate with the other victims. We're going to present a united front at the trial, show the jury exactly how much damage one man can do when he's allowed to operate without consequences." I felt a surge of pride listening to these 2 young women transform their pain into purpose. David had counted on his victims being too ashamed or embarrassed to fight back. He'd underestimated the strength that comes from women supporting each other, from shared truth, cutting through individual doubt. "What can I do to help?" I asked. Sarah looked at me with gratitude and determination. "You've already done everything, Mom. You saved Grandmother's ring. You exposed David's crimes, and you showed me that I'm stronger than I ever knew. Now it's our turn to make sure he never hurts anyone else again." The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal preparations and emotional healing. Sarah moved back into her own apartment, determined to rebuild her life on her own terms. Rebecca returned to Portland, but stayed in constant contact, coordinating with other victims and working with federal prosecutors to build an ironclad case against David. Margaret kept us updated on the legal proceedings, which were moving faster than anyone had expected. David's lawyers had initially planned to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, recorded phone conversations, testimony from dozens of victims across multiple states. The case against him was so strong that even his high-priced attorneys were recommending a plea bargain. "He's looking at a minimum of 25 years, Margaret told us during one of our weekly updates. "The federal prosecutors are pushing for 40 to life, given the scope of the fraud and the number of victims involved. His lawyers are trying to negotiate something in the 30-year range, but honestly, I don't think the judge is going to be lenient." Sarah had thrown herself into victim advocacy work, connecting with women across the country who'd been targeted by romance fraud schemes. She'd started a support group that met weekly, providing a safe space for victims to share their experiences and rebuild their confidence. "You know what I've learned?" Sarah told me one evening as we prepared dinner together in my kitchen. "David wasn't special. He wasn't uniquely charming or particularly intelligent. He was just willing to do things that normal people would never consider. He had no conscience, no empathy, no genuine human connection to anyone." That's what made him dangerous," I replied, watching her chop vegetables with steady hands. "Normal people can't imagine that level of calculated cruelty, so we don't protect ourselves against it." Sarah paused in her work, looking down at Grandmother's ring on her finger. "I used to think this ring was cursed somehow, that it had brought bad luck into my life. But now I realize it was the opposite. It was what saved me." "How do you mean?" "When David pawned it, he showed me exactly who he was. Not the loving husband who was struggling with business problems, but someone who would steal from his wife's family without hesitation, someone who saw our most precious possessions as nothing more than assets to liquidate." She resumed chopping, her movements precise and controlled. "If he hadn't taken the ring, I might have stayed with him for years, making excuses for increasingly terrible behavior. I thought about the chain of events that had started with my decision to give Sarah the ring, had led through David's betrayal to his eventual arrest. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be the catalysts for the best changes in our lives." "Your great-great-grandmother would be proud," I said quietly. "She wore that ring through the Great Depression, the Second World War, the death of 2 children from influenza. She knew something about surviving hardship and coming out stronger on the other side." Sarah smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen on her face since before her marriage had started falling apart. "Tell me about her again. I want to remember all the stories when I pass this ring down someday." As I began recounting family history, I realized that David's betrayal had accomplished something he'd never intended. It had reconnected Sarah to her heritage, to the long line of strong women who'd faced their own challenges and emerged victorious. The ring hadn't been cursed. It had been exactly what Sarah needed to find her own strength. The trial began on a cold Tuesday morning in February. The federal courthouse was packed with victims, family members, and media representatives eager to cover what prosecutors were calling one of the largest romance fraud cases in Pacific Northwest history. Sarah and I arrived early, wanting to secure seats where we could watch justice finally being served. David looked different than he had at Margaret's office. The expensive suits had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, the confident swagger by the shuffle of someone wearing ankle shackles. His hair was unkempt, his face pale from months in county jail. The transformation was startling, as if removing his ability to manipulate and deceive had drained him of everything that had made him seem powerful. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. Agent Walsh presented evidence that painted David as a serial predator who'd spent years perfecting his techniques. Financial records showed a pattern of fraud dating back over a decade, long before he'd ever met Sarah. He'd been stealing money from vulnerable people since his early 20s, always moving to new locations when his schemes began to unravel. The defendant operated with complete disregard for the human cost of his actions, the prosecutor told the jury. He didn't just steal money. He stole dreams, destroyed families, and left a trail of emotional devastation that will take years for his victims to overcome. One by one, David's victims took the stand to tell their stories. Maria Santos, the cleaning service owner, described how losing her life savings had forced her to declare bankruptcy and close the business she'd spent 15 years building. The Hendersons explained how David's fraud had cost them their bakery and their retirement security, leaving them unable to afford basic medical care. Rebecca's testimony was particularly powerful. She spoke clearly and calmly about the 18 months she'd spent believing she was engaged to a successful businessman who loved her. She described the elaborate lies David had told about his background, his family, his business success. Most devastatingly, she revealed that he'd been planning their wedding while simultaneously proposing to 2 other women in different states. "I gave him everything," Rebecca said, looking directly at David while she spoke. "My money, my trust, my future. In return, he gave me nothing but lies and betrayal. But I want the jury to understand something important. I'm not here as a victim anymore. I'm here as a survivor, and I'm going to make sure he never has the opportunity to hurt anyone else the way he hurt me." When Sarah's turn came to testify, she walked to the witness stand with the quiet dignity I'd always admired in her. She wore a simple black dress and grandmother's ring, the sapphire catching the courtroom lights as she raised her right hand to be sworn in. Her testimony was methodical and devastating. She described the gradual erosion of her self-confidence as David had isolated her from friends and family, the way he'd made her doubt her own perceptions when she'd questioned his behavior, the systematic financial abuse that had left her unable to leave even when she'd finally realized something was wrong. "The defendant didn't just steal my grandmother's ring," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. "He stole 3 years of my life, my ability to trust my own judgment and my faith in love itself. But he made one critical mistake. He underestimated the strength of the women in my family, and that mistake brought him down." David's defense team tried to portray him as someone who'd gotten in over his head, whose business failures had driven him to desperate measures. But the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The fake passports, the offshore accounts, the carefully orchestrated targeting of vulnerable women across multiple states. This wasn't desperation. This was criminal enterprise, executed with cold precision over many years. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, racketeering, and dozens of other charges that would keep David in federal prison for the rest of his natural life. As the judge read the sentence, 45 years without possibility of parole, I watched David's face crumble completely. The mask of charm and confidence that had fooled so many people was gone forever, replaced by the reality of a man who'd finally been held accountable for his crimes. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand as we listened to the judge's final words. "Mr. Mitchell, Your crimes represent a level of calculated cruelty that this court has rarely encountered. You have shown no remorse for the lives you've destroyed, no empathy for the victims you've traumatized. The sentence of this court reflects not just punishment for your crimes, but protection for the countless other victims you would have claimed if allowed to remain free. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was surrounded by other victims who wanted to thank her for her testimony and her advocacy work. Rebecca hugged her tightly, both women finally able to smile without reservation for the first time in months. "We did it," Rebecca said through tears of relief. "He can never hurt anyone else again." Sarah looked over at me, grandmother's ring sparkling in the afternoon sunlight. "We all did it. Every woman who was brave enough to speak up, every family member who refused to let him get away with it. We turned our individual pain into collective power, and that's what brought him down." As we walked toward my car, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. David had counted on his victims being too ashamed or isolated to fight back. He'd never imagined that his greatest mistake, pawning a family heirloom, would connect him to 3 generations of women who understood that some things were worth fighting for. The ring was safe, Sarah was free, and David Mitchell would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. But more importantly, we'd learned something about our own strength, about the power that comes from women supporting each other, about the difference between love and manipulation. That evening, as Sarah and I sat in my living room celebrating with a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, she turned the ring on her finger and smiled. "Mom," she said, "when I have a daughter someday, I'm going to tell her this story. About how a family heirloom exposed a criminal, about how her grandmother fought for justice, about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be the beginning of the best things." I raised my glass to toast not just our victory, but the long line of strong women who'd made it possible. The ring had indeed been passed down through 3 generations, but its real value had never been in the gold and sapphires. Its value was in the lesson it taught about resilience, about fighting for what's right, about the strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for.